The conference room buzzed with an electric tension that made the air feel heavy, almost suffocating. Across the polished mahogany table, Victoria sat frozen in her chair, her fingers gripping the edge so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her heart pounded like a war drum against her ribcage, each beat echoing the betrayal she'd just witnessed. On the other side of the room, her boss, Richard Caldwell, stood confidently at the head of the table, his expensive Italian suit perfectly pressed, his tie precisely knotted. He was presenting her idea, her groundbreaking $40 million concept, as if it were his own. Victoria's mind raced back to the countless late nights she'd spent perfecting this proposal. She remembered the weekends sacrificed, the sleepless nights illuminated only by her computer screen, and the moments of pure inspiration that had come to her during midnight showers. Every detail, every strategic insight, every innovative approach had been meticulously crafted by her hand alone. Yet here was Richard, commanding the room with his deep voice, gesturing confidently as he outlined what should have been her moment of triumph. Her eyes darted around the table, catching glimpses of the high-profile clients who had gathered for this crucial presentation. The representatives from Sterling Global, their faces masks of professional interest, nodded along as Richard spoke. These were the people who could make or break careers with a single decision, the gatekeepers to a future that Victoria had envisioned would be hers. Instead, she watched silently as her hard work was being stolen right before her eyes. The fluorescent lights above seemed to grow brighter, more oppressive, casting harsh shadows across the room. Victoria felt trapped in a surreal nightmare where time had slowed to a crawl. Each word Richard spoke felt like a dagger twisting in her chest, yet outwardly she maintained her composure, years of professional training keeping her face neutral despite the storm raging within. Her colleagues sat around the table, unaware of the theft taking place, their expressions ranging from admiration to envy as they watched their charismatic leader command the room. What made it worse was how effortlessly Richard delivered the presentation. His practiced ease, the way he owned the space, made it appear as though he had indeed conceived this brilliant strategy. Victoria knew better. She had lived this idea, breathed it, fought for it against internal resistance and budget constraints. Now, watching him field questions from the clients, answering them with rehearsed precision, she realized how carefully he had planned this betrayal. Somewhere between yesterday's final review meeting and today's presentation, he had decided to claim her work as his own. The weight of the situation pressed down on her shoulders, making it difficult to breathe. Her hands trembled slightly beneath the table, but she forced them to stillness, channeling her anxiety into maintaining her professional facade. The irony wasn't lost on her. Years of striving for excellence had led her to create something so valuable that it was worth stealing. Yet instead of feeling pride in her accomplishment, she felt the bitter sting of betrayal, the crushing realization that merit wasn't enough when power dynamics favored those willing to take credit they didn't deserve. As Richard moved through the final points of the presentation, Victoria's mind began racing through possibilities. Should she speak up now? Confront him directly? Or wait for the right moment to reveal the truth? The clients seemed impressed, their body language suggesting they were leaning toward approval. Every second that passed without intervention felt like another nail in the coffin of her career aspirations. Yet something held her back, perhaps the fear of immediate repercussions, or maybe the hope that somehow, someway, the truth would come to light naturally. Her eyes caught movement at the corner of the table. Mrs. Thompson, the lead representative from Sterling Global, was adjusting her glasses, her sharp eyes scanning through the proposal documents laid out before her. There was something about the way she paused, her pen hovering over a particular section, that made Victoria's pulse quicken. It was as if the seasoned executive had detected something amiss, some subtle inconsistency that didn't align with Richard's confident delivery. The tension in the room shifted imperceptibly as Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "this is certainly an impressive proposal. However, I'm curious about one particular aspect." She tapped her pen against a specific paragraph in the document. "This innovative approach to market segmentation, how did you arrive at this methodology?" Richard's confident smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Victoria to notice. She watched as he smoothly recovered, launching into an explanation that sounded rehearsed rather than authentic. "Well, Mrs. Thompson, through extensive market analysis and years of industry experience, I recognized certain patterns that led me to develop this unique approach." Mrs. Thompson's eyebrows arched slightly, and she exchanged a meaningful glance with her colleague, Mr. Chun. The older man leaned forward, studying Richard with renewed interest. Fascinating, Mrs. Thompson continued, her tone sharpening with curiosity. Because this methodology bears striking similarities to research published last year by Dr. Elena Martinez at Stanford, particularly her work on psychographic segmentation in emerging markets. The room seemed to freeze as all eyes turned to Richard. Victoria felt her breath catch in her throat. This was the moment she had been waiting for, though she hadn't anticipated it would come from this angle. She had read Dr. Martinez's research extensively while developing her proposal, incorporating elements of it into her broader strategy. But Richard, having merely skimmed the final document hours before the presentation, couldn't possibly know these details. Ah yes, Richard began, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty. Dr. Martinez's work was indeed influential. He reached for his glass of water, buying himself a few precious seconds. I attended her seminar last spring, which helped shape my thinking on this matter. Mrs. Thompson's expression remained inscrutable as she opened her leather-bound notebook. That's interesting, because according to our records, your firm didn't send any representatives to that seminar. In fact, we sent 2 of our junior analysts, who found it particularly enlightening. She glanced at Mr. Chun, who nodded confirmation. Victoria felt a surge of adrenaline as she watched Richard struggle to maintain his composure. His usual charm seemed to desert him as he fumbled for words, his earlier confidence evaporating under the scrutiny of experienced executives who valued authenticity above all else. Around the table, subtle shifts occurred, heads tilted slightly, pens paused mid-note, and attentive eyes began searching for cracks in the polished presentation. I must admit, Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge, that while the overall strategy is impressive, several key elements seem remarkably similar to proposals we've seen from other firms recently. Specifically, the integration of AI-driven customer profiling and the 3-phase implementation timeline. She fixed Richard with a penetrating gaze. Care to elaborate on how you developed those particular aspects? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Richard attempted to navigate these increasingly treacherous waters. Certainly, he began, his voice slightly higher than usual. Through careful analysis of market trends and... Victoria's mind raced as she watched the unfolding drama. She knew exactly where Mrs. Thompson was leading this line of questioning. The AI-driven customer profiling system wasn't something Richard could have possibly developed. It was based on proprietary algorithms she had spent months refining with their tech division. And the 3-phase implementation timeline? That had been born from countless discussions with operations managers, all of whom had worked directly with her, not Richard. Around the table, the atmosphere shifted subtly but unmistakably. The Sterling Global representatives exchanged knowing glances, their initial enthusiasm tempered by growing suspicion. One of their junior analysts, who had been quietly observing until now, suddenly perked up, flipping through pages of documentation with renewed interest. Victoria recognized that look. It was the same expression she'd seen on interns' faces when they stumbled upon inconsistencies during audits. The gravity of the situation hit her with full force. This wasn't just about her personal grievance anymore. Richard's attempt to claim her work threatened not only her career but potentially the entire relationship between their firm and Sterling Global. Major corporations like Sterling didn't just value innovation, they demanded transparency and authenticity. A fabricated origin story for a multimillion-dollar proposal could irreparably damage trust and credibility. Mrs. Thompson's next question confirmed Victoria's fears. Mr. Caldwell, given the complexity of this proposal, I assume you've assembled a comprehensive development team behind this initiative. Her tone suggested she already suspected the answer might contradict Richard's solo narrative. Perhaps you could introduce us to some of the key contributors who helped bring these ideas to fruition? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade, its implications clear to everyone present. Richard's eyes flickered momentarily toward Victoria before returning to Mrs. Thompson. Of course, he replied, his voice steadier now but lacking its earlier conviction. Our team has been instrumental in... He hesitated, clearly realizing too late that naming specific contributors might expose holes in his story. The Sterling representatives weren't letting him off the hook. Mr. Chun leaned forward, his expression serious. You see, Mr. Caldwell, in our experience, truly innovative strategies often evolve through collaborative efforts. We're particularly interested in understanding how different perspectives contributed to this proposal's development. He paused, allowing the implication to sink in. For instance, Could you walk us through the brainstorming process that led to the unique risk mitigation strategies outlined in Section 3? Victoria felt her heart pounding as she watched Richard squirm under the pressure. She knew exactly how those strategies had been developed, through intense debates during team meetings, where she had argued passionately for a more nuanced approach to risk management. The final product had emerged from weeks of collaboration, with her leading the charge and integrating feedback from various departments. The room seemed smaller now, the air thicker with unspoken truths. Around the table, people who had initially been impressed by Richard's apparent brilliance were beginning to piece together inconsistencies. The junior analyst from Sterling had started cross-referencing sections of the proposal against their internal database of similar projects. Mrs. Thompson's assistant was quietly typing notes into her tablet, likely flagging discrepancies for later review. What struck Victoria most was how quickly the dynamic had shifted. Moments ago, Richard had commanded the room with effortless authority. Now he stood exposed, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under expert scrutiny. The Sterling team's questions weren't just challenging his knowledge, they were systematically dismantling his claim to authorship, revealing gaps that only someone intimately involved in the project's development could fill. As the interrogation continued, Victoria noticed something remarkable happening. The initial shock of betrayal was giving way to a newfound clarity. She realized that the very qualities that had made her hesitate to speak up, her thorough preparation, her deep understanding of every aspect of the proposal, were now working in her favor. While Richard struggled to maintain his false narrative, she could answer every question being posed with complete confidence and precise detail. The sensation was empowering, almost intoxicating. With each passing minute, her fear transformed into resolve. She understood now that her silence wasn't protecting her career, it was enabling the very behavior she despised. The proposal wasn't just a collection of business strategies, it represented hundreds of hours of dedicated work, sleepless nights spent refining concepts, and genuine passion for solving complex problems. Watching Richard flounder under questioning, she realized that true leadership wasn't about claiming credit, it was about standing behind one's work with integrity. Mrs. Thompson's final question before the scheduled break cut through the room like a laser. Mr. Caldwell, could you explain the rationale behind the proposal's scalability metrics? Specifically, how you derived the threshold values for phase transitions. As Richard stammered through another vague response, Victoria felt a wave of determination wash over her. She knew every number in those metrics, understood the mathematical models that supported them, and could explain the real-world implications of each threshold value with absolute certainty. The Sterling representatives were gathering their materials for the break, but their body language spoke volumes. They weren't convinced, not by a long shot. Victoria watched as Mrs. Thompson signaled to her team members, who began discreetly collecting additional documentation from their briefcases. This wasn't just a standard review process anymore, it had become an investigation. The realization both terrified and exhilarated her. As the room emptied for the scheduled 15-minute recess, Victoria remained seated, her mind racing through possibilities. The evidence was mounting against Richard, not because of any deliberate action on her part, but because the truth inherently carried its own weight. The Sterling team's expertise had uncovered inconsistencies that no amount of corporate bravado could explain away. What had started as a personal crisis of ethics was evolving into something much larger, a test of integrity that could reshape her entire career trajectory. She glanced at her watch, noting that 23 minutes remained until the session resumed. 23 minutes to decide whether to let events unfold naturally or to take control of the narrative. The choice weighed heavily on her shoulders, each option carrying its own risks and potential consequences. Yet in that moment of quiet reflection, surrounded by the empty conference room and the ghosts of decisions past, Victoria understood that her response would define not just this project, but her entire professional identity. The break room buzzed with nervous energy as colleagues milled about, refilling coffee cups and exchanging polite small talk. Victoria stood apart from the group, her untouched cup of tea growing cold in her hands. Through the glass walls, she could see Richard deep in conversation with their department head, his body language tense and defensive. The contrast between his current state and his earlier confidence was striking. The mask of authority had slipped, revealing the desperation beneath. Around her, fragments of whispered conversations drifted through the air. Did you notice how Mrs. Thompson kept pushing on the data sources? One senior analyst murmured to another. Something doesn't add up with this proposal. Nearby, Two junior associates debated the technical merits of the AI integration strategy, their discussion revealing insights that Richard couldn't possibly have contributed to. Victoria realized with growing clarity that the truth wasn't confined to her own observations. Others had noticed the discrepancies too, even if they hadn't yet connected the dots. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, displaying a message from Sarah, her closest confidant in the company. "Are you okay? I saw your face during the presentation. This feels off." The simple text carried layers of meaning, acknowledging the unspoken tension that had filled the conference room. Victoria stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the reply button. How much should she say? How much could she trust? Movement caught her eye. Mrs. Thompson was speaking with her team in hushed tones near the window, occasionally glancing toward the conference room where Richard remained engaged in his urgent discussion. Their body language suggested they were formulating their next line of questioning, and Victoria felt a pang of sympathy for what was coming. The Sterling representatives weren't just skeptical, they were methodically building a case, their years of experience evident in their systematic approach to uncovering the truth. A young intern approached her nervously, holding a folder of documents. "Ms. Carter, I was going through the backup files for this proposal, and I noticed something strange. Several versions have conflicting authorship metadata." The girl's voice dropped to a whisper. "And some of the detailed notes match exactly with the feedback you gave during our team meetings last month." Victoria accepted the folder with steady hands, though her heart raced at this unexpected ally. The digital trail she had always maintained for accountability purposes might now serve as concrete evidence of her contribution. Through the glass walls, she observed Richard's increasingly agitated gestures. Their department head listened intently, nodding occasionally but maintaining a concerned expression. The dynamics of power were shifting visibly. The authority Richard had wielded so confidently earlier was unraveling before her eyes. Colleagues who had previously deferred to him now exchanged meaningful looks, their respect eroding with each revelation. Sarah appeared at her side, placing a supportive hand on her arm. "Whatever you decide to do, you're not alone in this," she whispered. "Half the team knows you were the driving force behind this proposal. They've seen your dedication, your late nights, your passion for getting every detail right." The words carried weight, reminding Victoria of the invisible network of support that existed beyond the formal hierarchy of the company. The clock ticked closer to the resumption of the meeting, and Victoria felt the pressure mounting. Mrs. Thompson's team was preparing to return to the conference room, their expressions resolved and focused. Richard's conversation with the department head ended abruptly, leaving him looking more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider what might happen if she chose to speak up, not out of revenge, but out of necessity for truth and integrity. As colleagues began filtering back into the conference room, Victoria noticed subtle changes in their behavior. Some avoided Richard's gaze altogether, while others offered him sympathetic smiles that lacked genuine warmth. The air felt charged with unspoken knowledge, a collective awareness that something fundamental had shifted during the break. Even the usually stoic department head seemed unusually attentive, his eyes darting between Richard and the Sterling representatives as if trying to anticipate the next move in this unfolding drama. The significance of the moment crystallized in Victoria's mind. This wasn't just about exposing a single act of intellectual theft, it was about establishing a precedent for how ideas were valued and credited within the organization. The outcome would ripple through every future project, every team collaboration, every ambitious young professional who dared to innovate. As she took her seat once more, she understood that whatever happened next would define not just her own career path, but potentially the culture of the entire company. The room fell silent as Mrs. Thompson retook her position at the head of the table, her expression more serious than before. Beside her, Mr. Chun had arranged several new documents in front of him, his pen poised for note-taking. The transformation in the atmosphere was palpable. What had begun as a routine presentation had evolved into something far more consequential. Victoria felt the weight of this realization settle heavily in her chest, each breath requiring conscious effort. Richard returned to his seat, his earlier polish noticeably absent. The confident executive who had commanded the room mere hours ago now appeared diminished, his movements hesitant, his usual authoritative presence replaced by visible unease. Victoria watched as he tried to compose himself, straightening his tie and arranging his papers with unnecessary precision, actions that spoke more of nerves than of confidence. The change was subtle but unmistakable, and it didn't escape the notice of the Sterling representatives. Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. Before we proceed, she began, her voice carrying a gravitas that silenced any remaining murmurs in the room, we need to address some procedural matters regarding proposal verification. She gestured to her assistant, who distributed copies of additional documentation to everyone present. Given the complexity and potential impact of this initiative, we require a more detailed breakdown of contributor roles and responsibilities. The request hit the room like a thunderclap. Victoria felt the tension ripple through her colleagues as they absorbed the implications. This wasn't standard protocol. Sterling Global was conducting what amounted to an impromptu audit of their proposal's development process. From the corner of her eye, she saw several team members exchange worried glances, their expressions suggesting they understood exactly why such verification was now necessary. Our due diligence process requires us to understand not just the what of your proposal, Mrs. Thompson continued, but the how and who behind its creation. We need to document the collaborative process, identify key decision-makers, and verify the authenticity of claimed innovations. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. To that end, we'll be conducting individual interviews with team members after the session concludes. The announcement sent a shiver through the room. Individual interviews meant no more safety in numbers, no opportunity for collective obfuscation. Each person would have to account for their specific contributions, unable to hide behind general statements or shared responsibility. Victoria watched as Richard's face drained of color, his fingers nervously tapping against the table. The department head, sitting beside him, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly recognizing the potential ramifications of what was unfolding. These interviews will focus particularly on the proposal's core innovations, Mrs. Thompson elaborated, her sharp eyes scanning the room. We'll need to understand the genesis of key ideas, the evolution of strategic approaches, and the technical foundations of your recommendations. She tapped her pen against a specific section of the proposal. For instance, the integration of adaptive learning algorithms in your customer engagement model. We need to understand exactly who developed that aspect and how. The specificity of her questions revealed the depth of their investigation. Victoria realized they weren't just verifying Richard's claims, they were reconstructing the entire development process piece by piece. Around the table, team members began discreetly exchanging glances, their body language suggesting they understood the implications. Those who had worked closely with Victoria on specific components seemed particularly uneasy, aware that their testimony would inevitably lead back to her. Therefore, Mrs. Thompson concluded, we'll reconvene tomorrow morning to continue our evaluation. By then, we expect to have completed our initial round of interviews and verified the authenticity of all claimed contributions. She fixed Richard with a penetrating stare. I trust this time frame is acceptable? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Richard managed a weak nod, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The department head interjected quickly, attempting to regain some semblance of control. Of course, Mrs. Thompson. We'll ensure full cooperation with your verification process. As the meeting adjourned, Victoria felt the room transform into a pressure cooker of anticipation and anxiety. Colleagues who had previously maintained professional distance now sought her out with subtle gestures and meaningful looks. The intern who had shown her the metadata discrepancies approached again, this time with a USB drive containing backup files. Make sure you have everything you need, he whispered before moving away. In the hallway outside the conference room, small clusters formed as team members processed the day's events. Victoria observed how the dynamics had shifted. Those who had once aligned themselves with Richard's authority now gravitated toward others, seeking new centers of influence. The department head was deep in conversation with HR representatives, their expressions suggesting they understood the gravity of what might unfold. Whispers of compliance issues and intellectual property concerns drifted through the air. Yet amidst the growing chaos, Victoria felt an unexpected sense of calm. The truth was no longer something she needed to fight for alone, it was becoming an inevitability driven by the very processes designed to protect corporate integrity. The Sterling team's methodical approach had created a situation where deception would be impossible to sustain, and authentic contributions would naturally rise to the surface. As she gathered her materials to leave, she noticed Mrs. Thompson watching her with an expression of quiet understanding, as if recognizing the role she would play in resolving this situation. The journey home felt like moving through a dreamlike state, each familiar landmark passing by in a haze of conflicting emotions. Victoria gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles still bearing the memory of that conference room table. The city lights reflected off her windshield, creating patterns that mirrored the swirling thoughts in her mind. Should she prepare a formal statement? Gather more documentation? Reach out to HR? Each option carried its own set of risks and consequences, yet none felt entirely sufficient for the magnitude of what lay ahead. At home, she paced her living room, the silence amplifying her racing thoughts. The evening news droned in the background, its cheerful anchor reporting on corporate mergers and acquisitions, stories of success built on foundations of trust and integrity. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, caught in a web of deceit that threatened to undermine everything she believed about professional ethics and personal achievement. Her achievements, once sources of pride, now felt like burdens she wasn't sure how to carry. The weight of decision pressed heavily on her shoulders. Speaking up meant challenging the established order, risking retaliation from those who valued loyalty over truth. Yet remaining silent would mean complicity in a system that rewarded manipulation over merit. She thought about the interns she mentored, the young professionals who looked to her as a role model. What lesson would she teach them by staying quiet? More importantly, what kind of professional did she want to be when this ordeal was over? Her phone buzzed repeatedly on the coffee table, messages from concerned colleagues, supportive friends, even anonymous tips from others who had witnessed similar situations. Each notification added another layer to her dilemma. The scope of the issue was expanding beyond her personal experience, revealing patterns of behavior that affected the entire organization. This wasn't just about her proposal anymore, it was about setting a precedent for how ideas were valued and protected within the company. As she finally settled into her couch, surrounded by scattered notes and highlighted documents, Victoria realized something profound. The answer wouldn't come from weighing pros and cons or calculating political maneuvers. It would emerge from her fundamental beliefs about what constituted meaningful work and ethical leadership. The woman who had spent countless nights perfecting that $40 million proposal deserved to stand behind her work with the same integrity she had poured into its creation. The question wasn't whether she could find the courage to speak up, it was whether she could remain true to herself if she didn't. As dawn broke, Victoria made her decision. She gathered every document, email, and note that traced the proposal's evolution, her hands steady now with purpose. The truth wasn't just her weapon, it was her responsibility. Mrs. Thompson's team would get the full story, backed by undeniable evidence. Richard's facade would crumble under scrutiny, but this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. Her voice would no longer be silent, her work no longer invisible. Integrity mattered more than fear, more than power, more than anything. As she walked into the office that morning, head held high, she felt a rare clarity. The world might not always reward honesty, but it could never take away her courage to fight for it. And in that moment, Victoria knew she had already won.